Hello everyone, today we talk about the Roman primacy of honor in the Christian Church. This is a particularly important topic that today we will address broadly, observing the other topics that in general offer a very good picture of the transition and transformations in political power during late antiquity. And we will be focusing, in fact, from strictly the Roman perspective, one of the city of Rome and its church. That is indeed one of the most, it's a unique institution, historically speaking, that still survives after 2000 years, and that at this very moment in history was setting the basis for the further developments that occurred chiefly from the starting from in the High Middle Ages with the Gregorian reforms in the 11th century, but that had in fact started a path, an evolution that would bring to worldwide impact on in the way that we all know. So there can be several perspectives from which this can be approached. I think there is one that it's useful to start with because it allows to frame better the Roman primacy and uniqueness in this late antique Europe and Mediterranean. And this starts looking at the importance, the significance of Italy, historically speaking. So obviously we are still in the Roman Empire. The empire has not finished, has not changed. We will start from now. We are talking. We don't have a specific century, but talking about this late antiquity and all the processes that brought to it fundamentally, and the city of Rome, as a matter of fact, actually remained the center of the empire in many ways, especially from a cultural point of view and in this ecclesiastical organization, albeit the capital. Now there were other capitals fastly arising in the empire. In the same Italy, the administrative capitals were Milan, then Ravenna. There were many other important cities all over the empire: Trier, Nice, Nicomedia, eventually Constantinople. And other great centers of same Christianity. Just think about Alexandria or Jerusalem, of course, or Antioch, etc. That were part of this great, let's say, Romano-Hellenistic culture that functioned fundamentally on the base of a very solid structural base that was, in this sense, infrastructurally served, connected by the imperial authority and military control, and that in a certain sense made this, especially Mediterranean areas, evolving in a rather homogeneous way. Italy was being in the center of the Western Mediterranean, perfectly comprehended by this into this system. Rome remained, in spite of its political decline, one of the greatest cities of the empire, and still one of the most culturally influent, definitely the most important city in the West from this point of view. I'm stressing this, and to some of you it may sound strange because there is a great emphasis sometimes on the other side, like saying that the general perception is Rome fell. There is the prejudice that at a certain point Rome, and not Rome just meant symbolically, but the actual city of Rome kind of at a certain point disappeared and turned into, I don't know, a village or a town. Absolutely not. Rome maintained for all the early Middle Ages it was the most important cultural, most developed cultural center of Western Europe. It was also at the same time the largest city in Western Europe, and the same context between Europe and the Mediterranean this time were filtered to it. Obviously, chiefly concerning Western Europe. Then, of course, Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe had this direct control, the Byzantine power, etc. That in some ways also extended and re-extended on Rome. This connection is particularly important. Rome is definitely a Western city, but it always remained connected to the East during this process. Even during up to the 12th century, fundamentally, the popes looked, we can't say really more favorably, but always with a very clever political intuition, still to the east, when trying to expand their power, to assess, to affirm their prerogatives, etc. And this is exactly this kind of in-between position that Rome and Italy at large started to acquire into late antiquity, because from one side we have Italy as, let's say, a bridge between this Central European world that is mostly ruled and directed by the Germanic military force, and the attraction represented by the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire. This is a contrast that obviously in late antiquity was still not so evident, because as long as there was an empire in the West, Rome was within that empire. It was still the important place that we know, even when Theodoric was sent with his Ostrogoths by the same eastern half. Now it was like the empire after Odoacer had given back the military, the imperial ensigns to Constantinople. When Theodoric came to rule on Italy, let's say in Italy, on behalf of the Roman Emperor, he revered the Roman Senate. He went to Rome, and the Pope, especially also at this time, in spite of all the general problems that posed his Germanism, his Arianism, even in terms of faith, in the sense of doctrinal questions, the Roman Senate effectively worked together with the Germanic nobility in Theodoric's consistorium of Ravenna. So you have this active participation of the Roman Senate and of its ecclesiastical institution at this point into the matters of these kingdoms. The primacy of Rome at this point was already pretty clear. We will address the topic later, but just to make you understand how fundamentally Rome always remained an entity on its own in many ways, especially when the political rule of the empire came came apart fundamentally into the West, and the situation all around went fragmented. Think about just in the 6th century, when you have the Longobards from one side, the Byzantines from the other. And Italy, in this sense, represents a middle ground, an area that is central by definition, how it had been since the ancient times, with for the Mediterranean, for the same Rome was in fact the base of expansion of the Roman Empire, was that had its, in this sense, its strategical advantages because of the geographical location. But during early medieval times, this centrality, albeit remaining, is also, if you want, enriched really by the peripheral position that Rome had respectively to Germanic Europe and the Byzantine Mediterranean. And this was very cleverly exploited by the popes, because that's how also in part this prestige, this authority was progressively built, not just from a religious point of view, it was very ideological and symbolical, but also from a political one. So that we'll see that since the 6th century, the popes were able to direct the evangelization of the European populations, of having a massive influence on even in the same affairs of the balance of the Mediterranean in terms of churchly decisions in doctrinal matters, etc., that pose a serious problem. For instance, when Constantinople tried to, let's say, to come closer to certain heretical movements in order to save the eastern provinces before the Islamic conquest, etc. And it's the same papacy that we have described many times in several videos on Schwerpunkt. that was able, in fact, to restore in some way the Western Empire, conferring the Franks, the Carolingian Franks, the imperial authority fundamentally, and the creation of a Western Empire that obviously you can debate whether it was Roman or not, of course, but that de facto existed and definitely shaped the political balance of medieval Europe. Not that the popes created the Carolingian Empire, but definitely the imperial crowning of Charles the Great was a turning point in history, a massive watershed in historical importance in world history, and it effectively affected all European history henceforth, and had imposed some dynamics that fundamentally survived till even the contemporary era fundamentally. So this is particularly important to understand. Not the I get especially a little bit disappointed, let's say a little, just a little, when I hear that, I don't know, that the church in Middle Ages was kind of a passive or even parasitory entity that somewhat existed there for no reason. The church at this time had an immense power that was not based just on the ideologies or in the beliefs, but in this sense was looking very far, very beyond. The church had an enormous organization capability. Now we could make a countless list of let's say political or administrative or even theoretical achievements that the church obtained during the medieval times, that put it ahead of much of the rest of Europe in terms of comprehensive view also of Europe, because the church at this point was definitely meant to be universal. There was nothing like still, even during the schism, obviously after the schism in the 11th century, everything was oriented to the restoration of the ecumenic character of the ecumenic dimension of the church, etc. It was not ever put into discussion. It's the Protestant reform that effectively broke the tradition and had a very different impact on this, even on the political development of the church, etc. But aside from this, the point I wanted to make is that the church effectively led much of the political and institutional development, at least of Western Europe during early medieval times. And this was done effectively from Rome. Even the idea that, of course, there were many differences between the local churches, which was absolutely true, still cannot grow us, make us forgetful of the fact that objectively Rome at this point was having already a direct influence on the internal affairs of all the various Christian countries in Western Europe, and that was able to coordinate things like, in fact, chiefly the evangelization, but also the local organization of the church, etc., to impose models that from Rome were exported elsewhere. Just think about how in the Anglo-Saxon church, the previous Irish model was ecclesiastical organization was effectively replaced by the Roman one under Gregory the Great, etc. So great influences that went far beyond what was the reach basically of every other political entity, say up to at least the Carolingian Empire, that eventually collapses, however, pretty soon, and therefore and that maintained even afterwards as this I don't even know how to call it, but in fact omnipresent, ubiquitous presence in Western Europe. So, but this will go for another chapter, let's say. Here we are still relatively at the beginning. Excuse me, I drink a lot before I go on. So Rome as a city was definitely inheriting much of the imperial legacy that the Romans had given to initially to Italy, if you want, because Italy had, as we were said before, because of this geographical configuration, had always this centrality in the Mediterranean, would keep to have it. And but also in its cultural legacy, in the Roman ability to expand. This is particularly important, and to re-elaborate the Hellenistic, let's say, the I would say the civil asset of the Roman Empire with the Hellenistic and Eastern culture in the West. I know it's a bit foggy what I'm saying, maybe if you're not really into these topics, but the point in here is that the Roman Empire had worked in this great for this great achievement of creating a universal empire. This cannot be forgotten. The Roman Empire was not just an empire like all the others. Yes, of course, there were other empires that had the same attitude. The Persian Empire, the Alexandrian Empire, the Chinese Empire, all had this, and eventually even the Caliphate, etc., all had this universal goal. Also because at the time, really, everything, there was nothing properly secular. We always fall into this trap, believing that empires, I don't know, like the one of Rome, etc., were kind of secular institution. Sometimes you even find, the fact they were kind of, secularly built with this kind of modern mindset towards it. It wasn't absolutely like that. The Roman Empire existed only because of a religious ideal. Religion was at the base of everything. The Roman Empire fundamentally is just what the celestial deity of the skies, of all the Indo-European peoples, gave to the Romans, ideally, to extend their power all over the world. And universalism, in this sense, is all one with what you refer to, divinely speaking. That is, if you effectively are given power by the greatest god of all, for the Roman was Jupiter, that is fundamentally just the Latin version of the Indo-European deity of the skies, of military glory, etc., the symbol of the eagle, just, guessing where it came from, that you find even in the Gospels, that is obviously meant to, is always a legacy of this ancient ideal, was at the base of the Roman rule. And when we talk about early Christianity, we have to understand that early Christianity was developing into a polytheistic world. I mean, early Christians were definitely polytheists. That's how they reasoned, how they lived. And for us today, it's kind of difficult to reason in polytheistic terms, because, in fact, we came from a monotheistic background. But, in fact, even the same concept of polytheism is a monotheistic concept. But at the time, it was perfectly normal. There was a set of entities, let's say, that it's even difficult to say the polytheism, because in our mind we've been taught in schools that polytheism is a sort of pantheon with just that dozen of gods that are perfectly defined, etc. But there's never been really such a thing back in the day. The world was populated by potentially infinite deities that are even difficultly frameable as such. I mean, many peoples, even in Central Europe during the same Roman Empire, believed were fundamentally animistic still in idea. For instance, the Germans didn't quite have a pantheon. They weren't really polytheists. There was nothing like, not even the Celts had that. These were peoples living with certain deities that were more like a concept than actually an anthropomorphic being that had this and that lived into nature, etc. There was still a very great mix with all the previous all the animistic deities that also existed previously to the Indo-European migrations in there. So this is very complicated, and the Church of Rome, in this sense, was simply inheriting, in many ways, and the Church in general was inheriting great part of the symbolisms of this legacy, etc., and the deity that Christianity was bringing on, in this sense, was perfectly overlappable to the deity that the empire was based on. And that's why it was relatively easy, in fact, for the empire to switch so quickly from paganism to Christianity, because all in all, these symbols were pretty similar. Even before the Christianization, definitely the same religion of the empire had definitely gone pretty much towards the enotheistic direction. There was this idea of a unique god, a unique entity that was taking shape, and everything was definitely progressive. So Rome as the capital, always remember that Rome remained always the capital of the empire. When you say, well, no, the capital was shifted to Constantinople, then to Ravenna, etc., it's not true. Rome was always the capital of the empire. Guess why? Because it was sacred. This empire was not secular. Capitals were switched just for administrative reasons, and as we will see now, there were certain additional values attached to it, like the ones of charity, for instance, that even were attached naturally to the local church and metropolitic seat. But fundamentally, Rome was believed by anyone at the time to have been the greatest thing ever that had been chosen by the deity, whichever it was, for creating the empire, and from a Christian perspective, to be the martyr, the seat of martyrization of Saint Peter and Saint Paul. So that made it the ultimate, because from every perspective you wanted to watch Rome from, that was the best thing that existed in the whole world from their perspective. And it kept being so, and that's why the enormous prestige of the Church of Rome comes from, survived, and Rome was not just a peripheral center with no meaning attached, or without any political or particular strategical importance, because it still was this great center of coordination and configuration of even the spiritual belonging of the West. Naturally, these terms that I'm using are very, can be very, they're debatable. Because they're blurred, simply. So we're talking about the West, we're talking about the center. It's complicated to define. But broadly speaking, the spiritual grandeur and authority of Rome was never put into discussion, ever. If not in later times, when especially West and East kind of separated, more or less. Also, this is a debatable concept, because fundamentally, not even after the schism, you can't really talk about such a thing, because the world was still pretty much interconnected, especially Europe and the Mediterranean were always in continuous and ceaseless contact. This idea of the Middle Ages that kind of froze, nobody traveled, is a typical, besides being a joke, historically speaking, is stressing a kind of localism / identitarism that is especially kind of north-centric, for saying, at a certain point everything, the darkness fell at the point. Well, no, especially if you look at this southern perspective, if you look at it from an Italian perspective, or a Byzantine perspective, you realize that this is completely false. And even if you study, in fact, the history of Northern Europe or other countries, you realize that the concept of the empire and the holiness and the power of Rome as a center geographically located, so not just like something, conceptually like a myth in a tradition here, was very strong even among these populations of Central or even Northern Europe, and that fundamentally Rome was truly the center, not just of Christianity, but of the world, of the Western world, at least at the time. And it's complicated as a concept, especially if you're not acquainted to it. Sometimes I read certain medieval history manuals that do not completely ignore this perspective, because they're based on other, not even assumptions, but simply they shift the interest towards either directions, which is fine when, of course, you want to teach maybe the history, let's say the history of Europe to a certain nation, to the children of a certain state in Europe that naturally is more interested, I don't know, maybe in its own regional perspective. But when you come to talk as this concept like universalism, etc., especially during the Middle Ages, you can't do without this omnicomprehensive perspective, because you at that point you don't understand what that past really was, and you can't understand medieval history just as ancient history without the concept of universalism. And this cornerstones of the same idea of let's say of the same world at the time, in many ways. There were Rome, Jerusalem, definitely, and that were in the minds of everyone at the time, or was Christian at least, but not even, because even beyond, even the Vikings knew about these worlds, knew about the importance that was attached to them, and they revered, in this sense, the greatness of the deity that had granted that. Because this is also another weird perspective that exists out there, that we deal with Christians and pagans during early medieval times as if they were fundamentally two opposing nations that were at war against each other, and that everybody was clashing because of religion. It was so oppressive, and it really drove everything from one side or another. It wasn't like that. Simply because the original divine, the original religion fundamentally had never quite, might have changed its semantics, its values, etc., but fundamentally was still the same. I mean, the Vikings that went to Constantinople and thought it was like the heaven on earth, etc. They were pagans, but they attributed to whoever was ruling there fundamentally this contact with the divinity, because the divinity was only one. We should stop reasoning in this monotheistic perspective, for which there were in fact the pagans and the let's say the polytheists and the monotheists, because at that time the idea of a single deity existed for everybody in a certain measure. So it was extremely easy to overlap these concepts, and especially the pagans were obsessed and morbidly fascinated with the Christian deity as well, because they realized it was the deity of the empire, of the Byzantine Empire, of Rome. And it doesn't matter where you lived in Europe, even if you came from the far north, you knew about the Byzantine Empire, you knew about Rome. And you were impressed by that. It was nothing identitary that said, okay, because how they believed at the time is that whoever had that power, that prestige, is because had won it for some merit that and was entrusted to him by the divinity. So the fluidity also of these ideas have to be pretty clear in mind, because otherwise you lose everything about the Middle Ages. If you think the Middle Ages were just an inter-religious clash between pagans or Christians, you basically haven't understood anything about medieval history, and it's an insult, especially to those who, in fact, you may have your sympathy towards, because you don't understand what they actually believed. Even the same concept of polytheism, there are a lot of people who call themselves neo-pagans or neo-polytheists, and they don't even know that polytheism as such never existed, religiously speaking. It's a monotheistic invention, that the systems of beliefs that those peoples had are completely different from what we are normally taught, and we still think like in monotheistic terms. This is particularly important. But I think it's powerful as a concept, and it helps to understand why Rome remains so important. Because otherwise, you can't. You might ask, why would this bishopric, this metropolitic seat of the Mediterranean, remain so important and powerful and influent and capable of changing the direction of empires, etc. If you don't understand what this concept really were about, and it wasn't just ideological. The Church of Rome was extremely wealthy and powerful. It owned a lot of land, so this added a lot to it. And that peripheral position between the Germanic and the Byzantine world I was talking to you about before, of Italy, and especially of Rome, that is in the middle of Italy in turn, really allowed the papacy to become effectively the balance, the tip of the balance, really, of European and Mediterranean politics at an international level, even and sometimes even at a transcontinental level, because effectively, from the 11th century onwards, the Church of Rome even led things like the Crusades, etc. And so this is particularly important to frame in mind clearly in an historical perspective. In perspective, you can therefore claim that the centrality of Italy at this point was being lost, because from one side the empire here had vanished, or was vanishing at least. The main centers of power, in fact, were being were shifting towards Central Europe and Constantinople. And everything around was also kind of tendentially escaping, or even from the control of these entities. Think about the darkest hour, let's say, like the 7th century, where the Merovingians basically are engulfed in their own wars. The Frankish Empire comes to disappear de facto at the end of the 7th century, because it was effectively 4 distinct kingdoms that were clashing in Gaul, fundamentally. The Byzantines are besieged by every imaginable possible people coming from the steppes or the Near East, and they're besieged by the Arabs. They lose like kind of half of their provinces. It's a mess. There is an economical contraction, the plague, etc. So this in turn brought to even the lack of a real central power that instead is revived during the 8th century. So in this time, the Roman power, the papal Rome develops is individualistic perspective in many ways, is able to expand its control as a single unifying force in some areas where everything was kind of fluid for the rest, even politically fragmented, etc. And that comes to reinteract, in fact, with the renewed Frankish Empire under the Carolingians and the Byzantines when they started to expand once again under the Macedonian dynasty, etc. But the concept of periphery, therefore, is particularly evident when applied to Italy when you consider the absence of an empire. I mean, it's paradoxical that the center of what had been the ancient world at this time, the Apennine Peninsula, at this point was really an area that was deeply fragmented, or maybe not so much still during early medieval times, but still, however, center of a local power that didn't have universalistic ambitions, right? Because the Goths didn't have, the Longobards didn't have, the Carolingians conquered central and northern Italy, and they formed their kingdom there, so that after the fragmentation of the empire there is this Italic kingdom that fundamentally goes on, but with a lot of uncertainty. And by the 11th century it's reincorporated under a Germanic direction, an Eastern Frankish direction, let's say better, and in order to form the Holy Roman Empire. The south is very fragmented. In fact, there is never until the Normans there is no reunification of the southern. So there is a lack of political authority in here, a strong political authority. Yet, you can argue that the Church of Rome fills progressively this gap in a very different way. Of course, the Church of Rome at this point didn't have, for instance, let's say as it would have in the low Middle Ages, like powerful armies and an actual territorial domination known as the Papal States and all, but it still managed to build ideologically and even politically this prestige that was an old story. It dated back to the same foundation of the Roman Church. I mean, of the first Christian community in Rome. A turning point in this process had been the 5th century, because in here, this is the century in which the Western Roman Empire, and generally speaking, the Mediterranean unity, was experimenting a political and military crisis. That's particularly evident. There are several events. There is the Hunnic Empire. There are other populations that press. The western half is particularly growing weaker and incapable of re-extending control. They could barely do it with Spain towards the 60s of the 5th century from Italy, but fundamentally even that went wrong at a point because of the Vandals, and that stopped the Romans basically before they landed in Africa from Spain. And at that point, with Majorianus, etc., it was understood that at least Italy didn't have any more manpower or economical resources to conquer now another land by itself. So that was a serious problem. And even in the 5th century, you have these great figures like Leo the Great, for instance, that met with Attila back in the day when the peninsula was invaded by it, that was already felt like this very heavily prestigious authority that could even talk with the barbarian, the chieftain, the terrible chieftain of the horde of the steppes, etc. It could stop it with its moral prestige, whatever. Naturally, history was really gone, and Attila withdrew from Italy chiefly similarly because of the plague, and because the Roman army was now threatening its links with its center, its fortified camp into the center of Europe. Therefore, that's why Attila withdrew. But that episode, for instance, is particularly important because it makes you realize how much the ecclesiastical authority had replaced, in part, the imperial one. There was still an empire in the West. This was done naturally in together with the emperor. With the emperor, it wasn't something that. Well, actually, it seems to have been a kind of really autonomous move from the Pope, but at the same time, yeah, the empire was still there. And also, we have said many times how really the western half of the empire could still survive the 5th century. Let's be honest about it. There was nothing teleologically, there was nothing decided. It was actually a case that the West was came to the exhaustion of its resources, because you see that, in fact, until the 60s, we've just said it, the Western emperors could even recover Spain from the Visigoths, so everything was kind of possible. The western half of the empire chiefly fell because of Gaiseric, king of the Vandals, that withstood the eastern Roman attack by sea and didn't give up like the Visigoths had done to Majorianus, basically. So everything was at that point still very possible, let's say. But the West falls, and therefore in Rome, as ecclesiastical center, grew proportionally, and definitely, as we've just said, it was also helped by the empire in part. Naturally, the West and the Western Roman Empire was benefiting of the Roman prestige in itself. Obviously, there was a very strict connection still during the 5th century, and even during the 6th, after the same fall of the West, a very strong activity that we have seen of the Roman senators that effectively ruled over Italy. They administered it from through the Roman state and the latifundia, etc. They effectively worked together with the Ostrogoths. Basically, the Ostrogoths only thought about military. The Romans thought about all the administration was still functioning. The real collapse happens when the Byzantines come to reconquer Italy. That effectively destroys everything, and it was still fault of the same Roman senators, because they had been the same ones who had called them the Byzantines to get rid of the Goths. But at the same time, there was this great authority of the let's say of the political let's say we can call it in this case the secular side of the empire. It was in fact the senators at this point. They were all Christians at this point, by the way. Excuse me, I drink a little bit again. You can see it brilliantly in the relations with the Goths. And we've said also before, the Goths were Arians, the Roman senators were Catholic, and so this was the general orientation, for which being Arian at that point didn't actually mean much, because most of these peoples were effectively very likely Christianized, and still retaining a very hybrid belief, especially at an average level, middle class level, let's say, if we can call it in this way. Being Arian at the time, like as a king of a Romano-Germanic power, equated to say, okay, we want to side from the side of the Central European perspective, if you want. We don't want the interference of Byzantium. We don't want the revival of the empire. We want to rule maybe on behalf of the empire, with the empire's blessing, if you want. But we want to be... This is what Arian meant. That's why the Franks, for instance, were not Arians, but Catholic. And why this, let's say, field of choice was so important at this time, even to equilibrate the balance of Europe. Very complicated. I made a video actually that explains this in detail, relative detail at least. That is in the Migration Era playlist. Let me give a look to it. There's something like 6th century balance of power. Goths versus Franks in Constantinople. That's pretty much it. So from this, I skipped this because I explain it, much more thoroughly on that occasion. But in all this mess, so when eventually during the Gothic War, the Roman senators are completely wiped out, because they are either exterminated, either they fled to Constantinople, but effectively Italy was destroyed at that point. Italy suffered terrible destructions in that case, and it had nothing to do with the barbarian invasions. It had to do with the Byzantine reconquest and with the scorched land strategies that both the parties, especially the Goths, but the Goths didn't have this great need to destroy Italy. On the contrary, they hoped to still rule in there, so that was just to win the war. But in the process, the peninsula goes destroyed. Obviously, not everything is destroyed. Italy remains is still actually the wealthiest land per capita in the world, the most urbanized one, very fertile soil, etc. So this allows eventually further developments, and also that will be more evident in the High Middle Ages, etc. There is no comparison with other lands of, especially in the north, in Central Europe, or even more in the north. So there was a vitality at this point of the peninsula that, however, didn't have any more clear direction, because the Byzantines, conquer Italy, but they don't have even an army they don't have resources they overstretched in some measure. Especially there has been the plague as well, so the Byzantines do not have the resources even to keep a mobile army into Italy, and therefore there are the Longobards, there is all this mess, and there is not a real center. The Byzantines create the Exarchate to rule more or less all the Italian domains. I made a video just recently that is named, it's about Byzantine Italy, an introduction, focused on 568 to 751. So this is also an interesting video if you want to understand the setting a little bit better. So it's obvious that the only institution at this point that, at least the most powerful institution that existed in the Italian peninsula, I say from debatable, but it's the papacy, right? Okay, there is the Longobard kingdom. It is also not this very small power, telling the truth, but it's still, in terms of political influence and cultural and religious prestige and cultural advancement, Rome is the soul of Italy in many ways. By the way, there is also very strict differentiation between, let's say, northern and central and southern Italy, because at this time, effectively, the Po Valley was very different from the rest of the peninsula, because the Po Valley was not a very advanced place in the ancient world. The most advanced places were these areas of central and southern Italy, even southern Gaul, that in fact were much good. The Po Valley had remained a bit, isolated from it. The Po Valley will grow consistently now, especially from the 8th century onwards. It will have an enormous importance in the high and late middle and low Middle Ages, as one of the most advanced areas is still in Europe. But because of this shifting of the balance towards Central Europe, right, that we were discussing before, where in fact the Po Valley is framed as a connection between Central Europe and the Mediterranean, etc. But at this point, still the Mediterranean dimension, so the Mediterranean Italy, let's say, is the most dynamic one. It's one of the largest cities with the greater economical dynamism, the highest cultural levels of education, of literacy, etc. And Rome is the very center of this. Rome collects all the legacy of this, also in terms of strictly of education, in fact, because this is also particularly important in a world like the early medieval one. Having someone who could even write was definitely, an incredibly valuable asset. So, for administration, for developing the local governments, etc., Rome was a bit the hub of all this. If you see the cultural influence that Rome had all over Europe during early medieval times, it's impressive. It all spread from that, especially in Western Europe, of course. It irradiated, it emanated, and it allowed other centers that were naturally connected to it to spark, to revive, reconstruct themselves, especially in this phase of, let's say, up to the 8th, the 9th century. Then there is the period of the second invasions once again that makes Central Europe, taking a greater shape, also with the development of the Holy Roman Empire, centers of studies, etc. But still, these are areas of Southern Europe that instead have an enormous inherent potential from a sheer environmental point of view. They're warmer regions, they have more fertile ground, they're connected to international trade. They have this enormous potential that will be effectively seen in the High and Low Middle Ages, where these areas literally boom and become the tip of the balance still of the West, but really at this point with a much more vivacious and not monocentric orientation. On the contrary, and that's was what also arguably made them so developed, because if you look at Byzantine Europe, it's not that it actually was that different. Greece and areas like Thrace and surroundings, even Anatolia, etc., were fairly, actually, there is this prejudice that they weren't fertile lands, but actually they were. They had a very high crop rate, they produced a lot, but effectively the monocratic rule of the empire seems to effectively crystallize the economy to make it grow sclerotic. And what you see is the Italian maritime republics taking over the economy effectively at a certain point, even with the Fourth Crusade, sacking Constantinople. So there is a transformation in this sense. Rome also partly got this character. Rome was effectively a Western center. The initial connections of Rome with the rest of Europe of Western Europe are pretty clear. The greatest center, let's say the greatest area connected with Rome in the effort for ecclesiastical and episcopal organization in the West was definitely Gaul. Italy and Gaul always maintained this very strong tie in history, especially naturally southern Gaul, but even the Frankish kingdom always, in spite of developing its own liturgy, its own ideological culture, etc., was always in contact with Rome. It mediated, it organized the expansion of Christianity. This is the more evident from the Carolingian times onwards, but still in Merovingian times this was pretty much accentuated. Gaul was very close to Italy simply because it was one of the most intensely Romanized provinces of the empire. It was a land that, in many ways, unlike Italy, had not gone destroyed during the migration era. We have seen that with the Gothic War, Italy, that at that point had been by far the best preserved Roman region, let's say, suffers this massive structural destruction. Gaul didn't, and this is particularly evident, especially at a political and social level. It's not really, from a material point, infrastructural point of view. It's pretty obvious that, let's say, northern France was much less Roman in nature, for instance, than Italy. This is true also for, we just said it, for Cisalpine Gaul, that is the Po Valley, etc. But these areas of, especially of central and southern Gaul, remain very much in contact with Italy, and together with Rome, together with Gaul, carried out this extremely important task of mediating between Germanism and Latinity that is at the base effectively of Western civilization, narrowly meant, of course, or let's say of Western Europe, narrowly meant. And this is particularly important for the history of the West, because this is an axis that fundamentally remained in historically. This is something you can observe even by the alliance between the papacy and the Kingdom of France during the Low Middle Ages. This is a matter of connections. Tuscany and Provence are very close. They develop even similar languages. They have a great literary exchange. They're connected even with Sicily. All the main traffics initially, especially during the early medieval times, passed through Italy and the Rhone Valley to go north to the north of France. So this was an axis through which knowledge, education, administrative models, organizational models passed, and they passed chiefly through the ecclesiastical relations. That's, as we've seen, were the the preferential channel of culture and of intellectual development at the time, and it was something big. This has to be understood, because since the very beginning, the church was thinking of itself as a universal power. So there was nothing like Rome individually meant and goal. Yeah, it is true that maybe I'm certain times I force too much the dichotomies, but so this is not something that happened by chance. Let's put it in these terms. It's something that was carefully, cleverly, and patiently planned and carried out. And it was aimed at expanding Christianity all over the European continent, at controlling the ecclesiastical hierarchies, and at making them operating synergically, at least at the beginning. And everything was kind of even relatively non-conflictual. Let's say that there weren't, especially if you consider the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons or the Christianization of other Central European peoples, was carried out in early medieval times with a common agreement between all the various political entities. Rome had its fiercest competitors chiefly in Spain and in North Africa before they fell to the Arab conquests, and that was a very big goal for Rome, because they effectively managed to, first of all, they got some of the most educated peoples that came from there, and that were coming, in fact, from that same late antique world that was still leaving even after the fall of the West in these areas, as we have seen. And they managed to absorb part of their cultural influences. In the case of Spain, even the Mozarab liturgy was erased by Rome. They enforced the Roman one. We'll see later this more in detail in terms of how effectively Rome was not meant formally to become the leading metropolitic seat of the whole Christian Church, even though it had this primacy of honor that made it effectively the most authoritative metropolitic seat in Christianity. So what is important is that, however, Rome starts to carve by itself a space where to expand, and to expand successfully. I mean, if you take the evangelization of England, you realize that was an enormous achievement for the time, an enormous success. Everything was also related to much more than strictly religious matters. This was an effective way of controlling certain assets, certain resources. Think about trade, think about donations to the church at this time. Think about all the Anglo-Saxon kings that, when they were old, in a nutshell, they all made their testament they left for Rome, and as soon as they arrived there, they died, and they left their what they had brought there. So for the salvation of their souls and all this. This is particularly important. And Rome is a very multicultural center. Rome maintained, just like in ancient times during the Middle Ages, especially in early medieval times, this very open and approach. It was extremely inclusive in many ways. Rome had several quarters that were effectively inhabited by foreign nations, like the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, the Longobards, even the Greeks, which included also, for instance, the Syrian refugees that came from the Islamic advances, were highly educated people, because Syria was in fact one of the most advanced areas of the Byzantine Empire, and Rome benefited even during the iconoclasm, and it's from the same Byzantine lands. Many Catholics in fact fled from the Byzantine government to go to places like Sicily, like Rome. By the way, Rome at this time the popes had an enormous amount of estates into Sicily, an enormous amount. Part of the reason of the shift of the papal political direction from Constantinople to the Franks passed exactly through the fall of many things. Actually, naturally, same iconoclasm wasn't such a very positive thing for for the papal Byzantine relations among all the other attritions. But especially when the Arabs conquered Sicily, Rome basically withdrew now from this Mediterranean dimension. It's in a more strictly confined Italic dimension that was also very important for developing at that point the territorial expansion of the papacy into central Italy. Talking about this international character of the Roman Church, you have to think that as it happened actually for many other Christian centers in the West, the Christian community of Rome, for the first 2 centuries of its birth, was prevalently Greek in language and in culture. This was perfectly normal because Christians came from the East, from the Hellenistic East, so they largely spoke Greek. Just think about St. Paul, and that Greek was the normally spoken language. So initially, all this in the first 2 centuries of Christianity, especially, Christians were people coming from the Levantine areas and bringing Greek as the main language. From the 3rd century, the church, the Christian community of Rome, first of all, massively enlarged, and in this process, naturally, it acquired a much more, evident Latin aspect, because it was now being joined by the local, Latins and Italics, etc. It was a huge community, by the way. Naturally, the fact that Rome was the capital of the empire in that period, deeply, favored the thing, because Rome was the place where all the religious novelties arrived first and had this somewhat fortune. Rome was plenty of different, there were temples to Isis, to Mithras, etc. So all the possible, this was done exactly in that pagan polytheistic, let's say, perspective that I was telling to you about. I mean, that world, the reason in a thing like, the more gods we put together, the better it is, because it's kind of more power, right? So Christianity naturally had a very different, obviously monotheistic character. Also past, let's say, aside from the persecutions that effectively outlawed the Christians up to Constantine, is still developed and flourished in many ways. And as we've just said, it wasn't confined in great part to the Greek slash Eastern minorities of Rome, of the city. And there were and there is immediately a very solid organization that is observable in it. This happened actually in all the Christian communities. Like, the Christian communities immediately had on the polling model a very disciplined, a very organized system. They were numerous, and they had a very solidly organized profile. And in Rome, especially, it was a metropolis at the time. Rome, at the peak of its power, as it's known, it seemingly reached 1 million inhabitants, some say even more. And there were, at this time, roughly 150,000 clergymen. Yes, this is important to remember, because we're not talking about actual believers and people who call themselves Christians. We're talking about the clergy specifically, 150,000. We're talking about priests, deacons, subdeacons, and other inferior ranks. This is nothing to be surprised of, because at this time, being a priest was something very relatively simple. Let's say priests, until the Saint Gregorian reform, basically could have wives, children, and they were effectively officials of the church in many ways. They were organizers, administrators, etc. And the same goes naturally also for the lower ranks, let's say. So the Christian church in Rome immediately acquires this very organized phase, right? That for which really the people wanted to participate into it. They wanted to participate to the hierarchy, to the administration. This was partly naturally a business, because we know that the Roman Church initially had, since the beginning, was very well endowed, or better, the major endowment came from Constantine when the cult was legalized, etc. But since the early beginnings, we know that the Christians had handled money. They had great, capability of management, of resources, of properties, etc. So this is naturally very meaningful, because it's as if it was a state in the state, or at least that's how Christianity developed at the end of the day, effectively. And that's why even the same Constantine and the other emperors granted the Christians to not just to profess their faith, but also to basically to substitute this state in certain, for instance, welfare activities, the management of hospitals, of other centers of assistance, etc., and much else eventually. Because that's in a nutshell also how the pagan world had been. The pagan world was largely a corporative world, which means that basically you all belonged to a certain group that had, it was usually a clientele with a master, with properties that were kind of a thing on its own. The Roman state, just like all the other governments at the time, was pretty light. The substance of the local communities was built by these congregations, brotherhoods. The same city temples, for instance, were normally kind of citadels on their own. This is especially evident in the great sanctuaries of the eastern centers of the empire, but That's pretty much it. They're all communities that live with their own means, fundamentally. And the Christian church develops in the same exact way. So it immediately gets this power, this ability of administering vast properties and handling money and putting itself into a dialectic relation with power. As we were saying before, the influence of the Roman bishop grew in parallel also within those Christian communities that were multiplicating themselves into the West. Albeit, and this is particularly important, even the Western Christian communities, believed, just like in the Eastern ones, that they were persuaded that the universal Christian unity had to rest essentially on the tie of charity among all bishops. Which means that fundamentally there was no real leader that could impose its own ecclesiastical authority on the bishops. Every bishop was at the head of his own diocese, of his own church, his own assisting the local community of the believers, of the faithful, etc. And that charity had to keep together the church and all the various bishops. So participating all together as fellow Christians to eventually establish also in common some sovereign episcopal decisions, like it happened in the ecumenic councils. So this had brought, by the way, since the very beginning of Christianity, to a very intense contact and communication between all the various dioceses. There were several synods that were, to which the bishops of a certain region, for instance, participated. There was a lot of dialogue, there was a lot of communication, etc. And this was a way to remain, in fact, even during the time of the persecutions, this was particularly useful because naturally this the Roman government was against them, and the idea was that the more you stay connected, the more you have this underground contacts, and the more you can easily survive. So this was also very useful from the 4th century onwards, when the Christians came out under the light of the sun, and were accepted, and because there was already a structure at the base of the church, it was already formed, was already functioning on its own. And the unity of the church had been particularly important. So the idea also the primacy of charity, let's say, the idea of charity as a gluing factor was particularly important, because as long as there was a common thread, a common common goal also at the same time, everybody was kind of capable of excuse me, I got distracted by one thing, but and the idea is that we stick together as Christians, and everything, and this is what objectively makes us staying together. So there was no secession in this sense. There were many troubles, definitely were heresies at the beginning as well, but when it came to the local organization, everything was very, very efficient, right? And Therefore, charity was a way to say, okay, that's what should lead us, what should bring us together, not an overruler that comes on us and dictates what we want what he wants. So from the 4th century, this changed a lot for quite evident reasons. First of all, the Christians, as we have said, were declared, the Christian cult was declared legal. So the Christians started to access even the higher ranks of society. Before they had been effectively prevented from doing it, so they were kind of outcasts, etc. Now they were effectively rising instead to the top of the imperial hierarchies in many ways. So this meant more power, just like the empire worked normally. These were large clienteles. So the more was the political influence and impact and authority, the more the local Christian communities went structured and basically found themselves as evolving and also in different dimensions. And say not all churches were alike. Effectively, the metropolitic seats were starting being regarded as centers of coordination. So there was a hierarchy even among the same bishops at this time that was kind of temporary, theoretically, or at least was just pragmatically chosen. It didn't have to impose itself as a real, dictating element of within the same church. But at the same time, was the same empire that used the Christian church for controlling its domains, its territory. During the 1st century, it was the same emperors that starting from Nicaea, as you think about it, in 325, was called effectively by Constantine to put an end to the Arian problem, because that was creating problems not just for the Christian community itself, but also for the empire, because these doctrinal clashes were causing unrest and disorders, etc. So the empire was pushing for the church to structure itself better, hierarchically, with someone at the top. The Council of Constantinople in 381 stressed the necessity of an adaptation of the ecclesiastical order to the territorial articulations of the civil administration of the empire. And this was pushed by, especially went in armory with the concerns of the Emperor Theodosius, that the episcopate, could give its religious contribution to the unitary functionment of the empire. This is in a nutshell why the Romans were so eager. The empire effectively not just made Christianity legal, but also why it immediately, kind of in less than 1 century, made it official religion of state, because they very cleverly understood that this organization was very well structured. It could help to control the various communities and to become a very valuable mean for the unitary, for making the empire stick together, especially from the cities. Remember that Christianity had, just like the Roman Empire, was based on the cities. So the needs in this sense of the two institutions overlapped, because the bishops were effectively settling to the cities. That's where they started ruling from. This was the norm all over the empire, and that's where the Romans basically controlled their empire from. So this could basically relieve the empire, for instance, from all the welfare expenses, etc., that were now entrusted to the church, etc. It was autonomously growing by itself. So it's at this point that Rome is recognized the prerogative of honor. So what is this actually? So the primacy of honor is this definition that is applied to the recognized, albeit still limited, supremacy of the Roman bishop before the Gregorian reform of the 11th century. So this implied the capacity of intervention into, say, to settle the theological disputes and into address the forms in the context of evangelization, but not of the government of the other bishops, nor the comprehensive recognition of that papal monarchy that effectively became formal after the centralistic reform of Rome during the 11th century. This is particularly important to understand because first of all, because of the main concept that stands at the base of the whole thing, that is that no bishop effectively was considered as superior to another. But secondly, the appearance already from this time of the idea of the papal monarchy as such. I made a video on the papal monarchy that deals essentially with the Gregorian reform, but the idea that there was a monarchic direction within the church since this time actually is correct. I mean, there was the idea that there was some primacy, even the same administration of the diocese of the rule, how it was created. So this primacy of honor was recognized to Rome for the obvious reason that it had the tombs of the apostles, Peter and Paul, the obvious foundation of Christ's church on Saint Peter, and guidance, and this is this was it was never questioned. There was no one who actually claimed, this is not true. Rome was revered and venerated in this sense, and it was miraculous, by the way, even from a Christian perspective, that the most important city of the empire, the capital of the empire, was becoming the same ideal capital of Christianity. We know that, for instance, pilgrimage to St. Peter's tomb was something starting since the very, from the very first centuries. So this great, even business that revolved around Rome, its activities, etc., in the organization of the church was pretty evident. If you take, I don't know, 6th century Rome, the Xenodochia for the lodging of the pilgrims, the hospital, etc., were a huge business. The popes made a lot of money through that. It was naturally used to reorganize even the city, because this is how this was turning on. The cities of the empire were being administered by the local bishops at this point. They were the ones who literally repaired the walls, who made the maintained streets, that they had this. Okay, well, maybe not, but this starts happening, however, pretty early in many ways. There is even a urbanistic dimension that is interesting to analyze. The first Christian centers were in fact outside the city walls. The same Basilica of Saint John Lateran was the same. Saint Peter was outside the city walls, because theoretically still, inside the walls there was this pagan center represented by the Capitolian hill, all the various temples that existed around in Forum, etc. Initially, the Roman aristocracy was extremely traditionalist into this. They didn't accept Christianity. Then it progressively adequated. In fact, the great episcopal figures were coming all from the senatorial elite. Eventually, it was this effective substitution. When you think about huge popes like Gregory, like Gregory the Great, that came from one of the most noble and educated and wealthiest, more powerful Roman senatorial families. That it's pretty obvious because that's what also senators had been doing before for the empire. That's how the whole administration of the empire was. It functioned. There was this contractation, let's say, to the local elites who effectively, through their clientele, spent money to, they spent money for the maintenance of making of the buildings, of the infrastructures, of the aqueducts, of the bridges, etc., of the city walls. And they paid for the games, etc. Now they did in order to expand their own clienteles. Now they were doing the same thing, but from the Christian side, and therefore just administering, by the way, the very same places, in the same way. So it was very gradual and functional and dimension and let's say evident dimension of in the transition between the Roman administration to the Christian one. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. That is also wrong to say, by the way, because the Roman dimension, what is the Roman dimension in the Christian one, were the same thing. Now the Roman Empire was Christian, effectively, so it was particularly important because there was a cooperation, by the way, between state and church. So besides this, I restarted to record, so maybe I can put a bit more of energy. I was distracted in the last minute, so sorry if I slowed down more than what I what I do usually already. But the 381 Council of Constantinople was particularly important because it gave a further official recognition to this primacy into the matters of faith and jurisdictional, ecclesiastical jurisdiction that the Church of Rome had already claimed, and that now was kind of reaffirming in virtue of the meeting of the convergence, let's say, that existed between the two. Between actually two specific theological conceptions. The first one was the attribution to Peter to the of one originary primacy among the apostles, like within the apostles. This is an attribution that actually started around the 3rd century by the Bishop Cyprianus of Carthage, and telling the truth, he had just expressed it in the sense of symbol of unity, and not of a jurisdictional supremacy of Peter over the other apostles. The other one was the attribution to the bishop of the Christian community of Rome of an exclusive right of succession to Peter's chair. So towards the mid-5th century, so at the time of Pope Leo the Great, we can start therefore to use the term Pope in order to define an authority that tendentially was already of universal dimensions within Christianity, and that is in fact used to be called Catholic. That is faithful to the theological decisions of Nicaea, and therefore, albeit the at that time the term Pope was still applicable to every bishop. the Roman doctrine of the jurisdictional primate of Peter and of the bishops of Rome, his successors, found in the West the official recognition of a rescript of Valentinian III. So here you see how progressively the West was already developing a little bit what the same Constantinople was doing, because you remember that the primacy of honor was attributed eventually even to Constantinople, because the Eastern Roman emperors thought, well, to do the same, to say, okay, well, but we are somewhat important, even if Constantinople had basically no religious importance whatsoever. They had basically to import the relics of the saints, of the apostles from other places, because otherwise there was no intrinsic, Christian importance in Byzantium originally. So this is particularly important because the West immediately understood that the primacy of Rome could be used very cleverly from a political point of view to expand his own power and prestige. And in the East, at the same time, the imperial court continued to attribute to the Roman bishop a primacy of honor that also was recognizing, together with it, a particular authority in the matters of faith, albeit in harmony with the rest. Albeit not really a universal supremacy in the ecclesiastical matters, and not even a decisional power, let's say an absolute decisional power in the theological matters, that instead was recognized to the great councils, the great ecumenic councils, called, summoned by the same emperors. So you see the different attitudes. Nobody was denying the primacy of Rome, because that would have created effectively pretty serious political rivalries between East and West, because how could a Roman emperor not recognize the importance, the primacy, basing himself on the Holy Scriptures on the diocese that Saint Peter had been called to administrate, and where Saint Peter had been martyrized, etc. And just thinking that at this point, the martyrdom was even gave so much to the local place, gave so much to the holiness of certain places, of certain places of cult, etc. So that brought, as we've seen, money, power, etc., and influence. It had to be recognized somewhat, but what the Eastern Roman emperors were saying, what the Western Roman emperors said was, okay, really, Rome is the most important center of Christianity. It should have this major, this doctrinal, this primacy, both in doctrinal and in jurisdictional matters of the church. So the doctrinal ones were less exploitable in theory, because especially at that time, there were kind of heresies in the East, etc., but it wasn't there was a fundamental unity in orthodoxy at this point of the Catholic Church all over the empire. But the most important one were the jurisdictional aspect of the primacy, because that equated to say, okay, I can dispose of the ecclesiastical administration at my own discretion as Pope. And this naturally changed a big deal of things. Naturally, at the time, the West didn't have the power to impose this in any way, because the progressive symbiosis that was born, for instance, in the East, between church and state, for which fundamentally better state and church, for which the emperors of Constantinople would come to be effectively to dispose of the church at their own will, something that in the West never happened. The Western emperors didn't quite have the power to do it. They didn't have probably even the interest to the means to do it, because still the two entities were kind of backing each other but separated. In the East, there was a struggle for this. Even in the East, the Constantinopolitan Church, for not talking about the places like Syria and Palestine and Egypt, absolutely didn't recognize, nor politically nor theologically, what the Emperor of Constantinople said. I mean, it was a churchly affair, not an imperial one. But progressively in Constantinople, the battle was won by the emperor. Like saying, okay, eventually the Church of Constantinople was being effectively never quite lost its autonomy, in the sense that, of course, there were patriarchs that came to oppose emperors, etc. But fundamentally, they operated in symbiosis, and it was accepted that that there could be an imperial interference, even in doctrinal matters, etc. In the West, there was nothing like that, and even historically, the papacy would maintain always this most obvious religious authority, even over the emperors that accepted eventually with the Holy Roman Empire, etc. Their fundamentally, at least, they never ventured into theological theories. Let's say there were political theories that naturally were based on, theologically speaking, but there was never like a doctrinal clash in the West for which, I don't know, the Church of Rome believed one interpretation of the Holy Scriptures and the emperors did. And it was essentially a battle on the political theories that were built upon those scriptures that were not questioned. In this, the situation was way more tumultuous. The same popes from Rome said, fundamentally denounced they condemned the Byzantine positions in matters of faith, because they were openly heretical. And they were right. I mean, until the Gregorian Reform, in fact, the Church of Rome and the whole Western Church was extremely orthodox compared to what was happening in Constantinople. That was, trying all the most equilibristic things in order to survive in terms as a state, etc. Even playing the religious card. In the East, however, the approach was also different towards Rome in itself. There was a primacy of honor. It was recognized to Rome, to the Roman Pope, but that only equated to a particular authority in matters of faith, and nothing else. It didn't come to. It didn't equate at all on a universal supremacy in ecclesiastical matters, or the absolute decisional power in theological affairs. This was the opinion, naturally, also all the other Greek and Eastern bishops that also were very much involved, as we have just said, into doctrinal disputes, etc. And what the empire recognized as more, as acceptable in terms of absolute decision was what was declared in the councils, in the great ecumenic councils that were called, in fact, very much politically in this sense, so that it's not easy even to first of all there weren't it's very difficult to define what is an ecumenic council, because today we mostly study like the most important ones, but there were tens and tens of councils and synods that were called all over the Christian world at this point that decided something. That could be something like local, but it could also take very interesting doctrinal turns in order to back this or that power at a local level, and even creating different liturgies, etc. So the Ecumenic Council of the Byzantine Empire was something a bit different, because that was the only place, effectively, in Europe where there was an empire, was a state, was a single direction. There was also a power that was able to extend itself effectively on several territories. Therefore, that could be engaged into this theological debates in the local clergy of the empire, etc., and that therefore seemed to be something more more unitary, more really ecumenical, albeit it wasn't ecumenical not really at all, because there were still many bishops attending this council from all over Christianity. The very first councils existed, like, think about Nicaea, that when the empire was effectively still united, with East and West was one empire. It happened also later, but there were councils that were called effectively even later, like even in the 9th century, and this were happening instead at a time where Western Europe had gone now by itself. It was having its own say into those things. By the way, increasingly detached from the Byzantine Empire, even as a general dimension, like what Constantinople said. Now nobody really cared anymore in the West, and that's why you have in the West something like the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy owning power, armies, launching crusades. So a world that now had completely deviated from, especially with the Gregorian reform, from this original homogeneity that existed instead in late antique times. But even before, what I meant to say is that the Roman primacy was not recognized even by other, or better, was recognized as this primacy of honor, but there were many churches also in the West that said, okay, well, but the Pope is not really the one that has, the absolute, power in this matters of faith or in ecclesiastical affairs. Even in Italy in itself, centers like Ravenna or Milan were sensibly, detached from Rome in many ways, for not talking about the Iberian or even the African dioceses that were something very, very far. So for centuries, actually, the Roman primacy was not intended in the way the Catholic Church has effectively built since the Gregorian reform. Another major turning point, not much in theological affairs, but rather in political ones, that favored this eventual evolution, was the creation of the Western Empire. The whole, the holy title attached to the Frankish Empire. The idea that now there was not just a recognition of not only the papacy felt itself so confident to declare that another emperor existed, or appointing him as such, but also it was territorial dimension that now was, let's say, recomposed, and that therefore could be used by the same papacy to augment his own prestige. That's how with the Carolingian Church things eventually evolved. The fact that Charlemagne recognized from the top of his power, ruling over an immense area of Europe, that the only head of the church was effectively the Pope, not really declaring it formally, but recognizing it as now a de facto It was a deal, really, because that's the same old story. If I legitimize you, you legitimize me, and vice versa. So it was convenient for both. Spain now and Africa had been conquered by the Arabs, so there wasn't the north of Europe didn't pose any kind of doctrinal problem at this point. It was still not it was not a single ecclesiastical center could claim anything against Rome. Wide areas of Europe were yet to be Christianized, so that was the moment in which there was a true even before the Gregorian reform, a true reorganization, let's say, of the Western Church, especially from an administrative point of view as well, because through the Carolingian Empire, the Church of Rome managed to reorganize the same clergy. The continental one, it was effectively Romanized. Latin was taught better. The ecclesiastical structures were more robust. Now, I'm tilting, as you understand, today. I don't know what I have, maybe a little bit of headache, but I don't know. The last part was probably, you can feel my my exhaustion. So I will stop it here. I don't know how clear it was, but I think it's important to think this specific topic, because it's very often given for granted, that the papacy was the center of Christianity since the very start, and it's true and false at the same time. And in my opinion, it's more important to recognize at this point the fact that it is true that Rome immediately had these ambitions, and that they do not start with the Gregorian reform, although reality out there was kind of different, and that there were other factors that brought to the effective rise of Rome as in the monarchical sense of the papacy, and also because I don't understand how you can understand the Middle Ages without considering the papacy in its actual power, and not just in this simplistic perceptions like the papacy was important just because, I don't know, because everybody was Christian, things like those. You have to understand why this this power had reached such a high level of development, of influence, and of actual power and control on the various of the regions of Europe at this point that had effectively not had much in common before, not even the same Roman Empire, if you think about it. But because there were regions that had not known that, or that where Christianity arrived effectively beyond. So whatever, I cut it short. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.